This is Deborah Stevens. I'm here with Randy Kelton and Richard Reeves. We are live at the AT&T Conference Center here for the G. Edward Griffin event. We're going to be broadcasting live also on ruleoflawradio.com. And we are also webcasting on George's website. And what is that website, Richard?
Liveonlocation.tv. Liveonlocation.tv.
Liveonlocation.tv. And we're here with Randy Kelton. Randy?
Yes, and make sure if you're not listening to this program that you tune in to ruleoflawradio.com. You can stream us even if you can't get us on 90.1. We're broadcasting 20 other stations around the country, but if you can't get us live on a radio feed, you can always get us at ruleoflawradio.com.
Yes, and the archives are available also. And tonight we are going to be broadcasting G. Edward Griffin's talk, his lecture, live on ruleoflawradio.com and also right here on 90.1 here in Austin. So this is a very exciting event. We've been setting up here the last couple hours. We got everything ready to go, and this is just amazing. We're doing it. We're doing it.
Yeah, we're doing it. This is going to be an amazing program. And I'll tell you, I'm impressed by this AT&T Conference Center. This is the first time I've been in here, and it's really an amazing place that they've got. I don't know who lined up this venue, but it's awesome.
Harlan from Brave New Books.
Wow. Well, see, we're starting to get some serious contacts here that's going to make us roll over the New World Order real in a simple fashion with all these big-time connections that we're getting for locations like this.
Absolutely. This is just a beautiful location. It's a huge venue, comfortable chairs. So we encourage everyone out there to come down here to the AT&T Conference Center, 1900 University Avenue, 2 blocks east of Brave New Books. And with that, I'm going to have to let you guys go because we have to start our radio show in about 2 minutes. So thank y'all.
Oh, yeah. If you're ever listening to the show and you don't hear me saying anything, that's because I'm trying to sound exceptionally intelligent. And that seems to be the only time I do.
All right. Thanks, all.
All right. Thank you, Randy Kelton. Thank you, Deborah Stevens. They'll be doing their live audio cast. They'll be doing their live audio cast on the ruleoflawradio.com network, ruleoflawradio.com. And also, we are going to be streaming live on location.tv. Of course, you're already there if you're watching this program. I'd like to say hi to everybody out there in live on location.tv land. And I just talked to Harlan, the organizer of this event, Harlan from Brave New Books. He said the event is going to start a little bit late, that John Bush and G. Edward Griffin are going to be arriving just a little bit late. We expect Harlan to announce here shortly that they will be starting late after 7 o'clock. So stay tuned in, and in the meantime, George Butler, myself, and other guests out here will be speaking a few words and bringing hopefully some information that you haven't heard. In the meantime, I would like to encourage everybody to go to medina4texas.com. Pretty much if you're watching and listening to this program, you're on the computer right now anyway, so go to medina4texas.com. That's who we're going to be working for, supporting for governor, and we've got a real shot of actually electing a patriot governor, folks. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Don't let anybody tell you that, no, Deborah Bonita cannot win, because look at the numbers that happened in 2006. In the 2006 primary, Rick Perry had 552,000 votes. 552,000. In 2006, in the general election, we had 1.3 million people voted to fire establishment candidates. Think about that, folks. You had 800,000 votes for Carol Keaton Strayhorn. You had 500,000 votes, roughly, for Kinky Friedman. That's 1.3 million votes for independent candidates. If we just swing these 1.3 million independent voters, who I now think are more like 2 million independent-minded voters, patriots, freedom lovers, liberty lovers, if we can bring in even 1 million, 1.5, 2 million, whatever it is, into this Republican primary and press that faux electronic vote button for Deborah Medina, which it could happen and we can make it happen, then we could easily win in this primary, because remember, Rick Perry only had 552,000 votes in the 2006 primary in the governor's race in the Republican Party. And so 1.3 million, 2 million, whatever it is, can easily overwhelm the Republican machinery, the Rhino machinery. which a lot of those rhinos are coming Patriot way. They're coming in for liberty and freedom, and they're coming in for the Constitution. So expect a potential turnout for Rick Perry in the 300,000 or 400,000 range, potentially. He could even lose votes. But what I do know, folks, is from listening to talk radio on the AM bands here recently, is that Kay Bailey and Rick Perry have recently amped up their battle. And they know, I think they're really afraid. I think one of the reasons that they're running so many ads on the AM mainstream talk radio right now is because they are fearful of the Deborah Medina campaign. And I think they want to try to squash it like a bug right now early here in December. And these ads evidently started on mainstream TV as well, on the mainstream programming that occurs on primetime, the big-time networks. I've heard that from outside sources that Rick Perry has already been waging a big ad campaign on those venues too, which tells me that here we are in December of 2009. It tells me that they're really concerned, because I think normally they would be waiting till later in January, all of February, and of course we have the primary March 2nd, 2010. 2010, folks, March 2nd, 2010. Make a note of that date. It is a critical date for our state of Texas. We have a real chance to fire the establishment candidates in these primaries and elect Deborah Medina, a true patriot, for governor in the Republican primary. It would just be an awesome event. It would stand the state of Texas on its ear. She would finally break through the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain of no media. They would absolutely have to cover her in the media then. Deborah Medina would get all kinds of coverage, and I believe it would go nationwide and maybe even worldwide, and you can expect the demonization to go something like this. Those crazy Texans, they've lost their cowboy hats. They've fallen out of the saddle, because they will be absolutely trying to demonize us for electing an outside of the box candidate for governor. But folks, that's what has to happen, and that's what we have to do. All right. So here as of yet, I see Harlan. Harlan is starting to approach the main podium. We should be able to get a word with Harlan here just shortly. As a matter of fact, I'm going to wander over there right now and try to catch Harlan and see if we can get a couple of words with him before he actually speaks in front of the people. And I know you can't see where I'm going, but at least you should be able to hear. And here's Harlan right here. Harlan, you want to get up here and say a couple of words real quick on the webcast before you go? Sure. We'll just get right at the corner of the stage. I know this is kind of spontaneous, but I know you can handle it. Okay. So, folks, thank y'all for tuning in on liveonlocation.tv. If we can stand right up here, and that way you can talk about what's going on here with G. Edward Griffin and John Bush. Here we go, right here.
Okay.
Up here.
Going this way?
Yeah, right here. We've got the camera over there.
Okay.
So, all right, and here we have Harlan from Brave New Books.
We're doing it on the.
I don't know how.
We don't need to do that.
Okay. No, he's just
we're not gonna.
No, it's liveonlocation.tv.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Live on Location. I'm glad George has provided us with this opportunity to broadcast nationwide. So, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully, we have a great lecture and a great time together. Okay. Thanks, Richard, and thank you, George.
Thanks, Harlan. Appreciate it. All right, folks, looks like the auditorium has really filled up. It's got a nice crowd here, so we should be able to have a packed house.
Look at him. He's a star. The next mayor of Austin, the governor of Texas, president of the United States, John Bush. I just want to mention a few things now. I want to mention that after, we're having a lot of fun here, and this is great, but afterwards we have a book signing at the bookstore just 2 blocks east of here. You literally will go downstairs and walk out the front door and see the front door of the bookstore. Or west, sorry, just west. I've been describing east all day for everybody calling me for this place, but now I have to reverse that. So west, and I always think of all the sort of conferences that go on here and the speeches given here. We have a pharmaceutical industry convention going on here when we're not here, and I always think it's funny that they walk out those doors and they see my bookstore. So it's pretty good. But I want to mention also all the people that helped get the word out about this, and that's We Are Change Austin for one. That's a great group that started. They meet at the bookstore at 11:30 every Saturday, so please join them. The Deborah Medina campaign, they're doing great work, and we all need to support them and get out the vote for Deborah Medina March 4th. Lastly, I'd like to thank the University of Texas. Check this place out. I think we've arrived, Patriot Movement. They've been very accommodating and very lovely people, and they couldn't be nicer. So, but what you've been waiting for, not listening to the boring bookstore owner, but actually listening to the very exciting book writer, Mr. Griffin. I just wanted to say I graduated from this university, so this is literally me coming home in some way. And I graduated with a degree in history and American studies. And on the first day of every history class, you have a discussion on a term. It's called cui bono. It's Latin for who benefits. And that seems reasonable, right? That seems instinctual. That's how we should construct history. That's how we should look at history. Who benefits? But every first day of class ends, and you have a long semester where you ignore that term, and you don't look at who benefits. And you ignore everything in Mr. Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And so you graduate like I did, thinking that you know history and that you know what the Federal Reserve is. I have a degree from the University of Texas. I have to know what the Federal Reserve is. Of course I do. But then you read Mr. Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and you realize you know nothing, like I did. And G. Edward Griffin had a profound effect on me. He gave me an education for $25 that I didn't get with a $30,000 degree. So I'm tempted to ask UT for my money back, but I guess giving us this place to hold this is a start. So we'll take it on a layaway. I just wanted to express my thanks to Mr. Griffin for writing that book, and I think everybody needs to read that book. If you're studying history, if you're not really into history, it doesn't matter. It's a very rich lesson in civics and understanding where we came from and where we are in history. And I think everybody needs to understand it. It's a very, very important topic of how money works, where it comes from, who makes it, more importantly, and what that means for us. But I'll let him have a profound effect on you guys tonight. And afterwards, you can go purchase the book at Brave New Books if you feel so inclined. And Mr. Griffin will sign it for you. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce the legend, even though he doesn't like me to say that, the legend, Mr. G. Edward Griffin. Please give it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I love being a legend. Well, I'm really disoriented tonight. I came expecting that, well, I'll walk in the room, will be, maybe 60 or 100 people, and I'll get up on the stage and then talk for about an hour, and then that'll be it. But I'm so fired up listening to what's happened already, and by seeing the size of this audience, I'm thinking I should just throw out my speech and do something else. Two things I decided I definitely wanted to do. One is I want to move to this town. And the other thing is I noticed after John took a drink of that water, he gave such a fiery talk. I want to drink that whole bottle over here. That was wonderful, John. I really appreciate your depth of the problem and your solution. Thank you. I came with my money hat on to talk about the Federal Reserve System and money, but I'm going to take it off just for a few minutes because of you, John. I'm going to put my ideology hat on and my Constitution hat, because you triggered a couple of thoughts that I thought were so important. You were talking about the Constitution and how wonderful it was, and how many unusual concepts were put into it for the first time in history. This was quite a rare document. It was the first time in history that a revolution had been fought, and the victorious side declined to simply declare themselves to be the new monarchy. I mean, that's the old style, right? You overthrow the king because you didn't like the king, because he didn't do what you liked, and he wasn't fair to your group, and so forth. You overthrew the king, and then you became the king. And it didn't take long because of the adage that we know that power corrupts. So if you're the king, now you've got the power, you become corrupted. And if you don't, by the way, the guy that comes along after you surely as heck will. So people have always focused on replacing people, replacing kings, monarchs, the bad guys, and they've never looked at the system. They always thought the system was okay, when reality has always been the system that was the problem and not the people. Because as long as the system has the ability to give human beings the power over other human beings, then that is going to corrupt human beings. It's as simple as that. And so our founding fathers came along and they got a hold of that concept, and they decided to change the system. Wow, what a thought. And so they wrote this thing we call the Constitution, which is, on one view, you can look at it and say it's a bunch of rules and regulations and directions of how to run a state. But if you really analyze it, it's a system of checks and balances, and as Jefferson called it, chains. You remember, after the Constitution had been written, Jefferson was engaged in correspondence with one of his friends, and his friend said, Mr. Jefferson, now that we have this new system in place, how can we be sure that only just men are elected to office? And those of you who remember this quote, remember Jefferson responded almost irately. He said, "Speak to me not of just men. Rather, let us bind men down with the chains of the Constitution." And in that simple statement, it was a fabulous political philosophy which really was the essence of our whole republic, to bind men down. He was saying, of course we're not going to have just men. Duh! Of course scoundrels are going to be attracted into bureaucratic positions, because as long as we give them the power to abuse other human beings under the protection of government, they're going to take advantage of that, of course. So we should not design a system that will ensure that only just men are elected to office. We must design a system that will assume that scoundrels will be elected to office, and design the system so that even the scoundrels cannot take away our liberty. It's as simple as that. Well, as John pointed out so eloquently, this was kind of a radical departure in history, and it was a wonderful departure, and it worked for about 100 years. But now the reality creeps in. It didn't last, did it? It wasn't perfect. If it had been perfect in some way, or in all ways, why, we would still have the chains of the Constitution. But now we know, with this experience, that, well, actually, the process started almost from the very first administration, the Washington administration. There were pressures and opinions and movements within the newly formed government to begin to break those chains of the Constitution. And although it was very small in the beginning, with the passage of time, and especially with the passage of the generation that died off and forgot all of these concepts, had forgotten the spirit of the American Revolution, who'd forgotten the heavy weight of the rule from England, forgotten all those things, with new generations coming up and new prosperity, all of these things faded into history, and people forgot to take a look at those chains, and one by one they were broken, one link by another. And so today we have practically no links left in the Constitution. And so it's our job, it's our privilege, it is our duty to repair the chain And I think that if we look at it that way, it becomes a very exhilarating challenge for us, because we can look at the Constitution, which in my view was a beta model. In history, I think maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, people will look back and say the American Constitution was a magnificent beta model. Now, with the experience of our era and the energy and the brain power and the consciousness of people like us, we will now design the second model, and we will build upon that experience and make it even better. Instead of lasting 100 years, maybe it'll last 500 years. And then it will probably fail too, because we won't see everything. But then at the end of the 500 years, there'll be a new group of people who say, aha, the model number 2 was better than model number 1, but it had some problems with it, so now we'll build model number 3, and that'll last for 5,000 years. And this is how the revolution continues. And that was John's thing. I'd like to add just one little specific contribution to what I think will be an important addition to the second model. I think perhaps the greatest mistake that was made at the creation of our wonderful republic was because the Founding Fathers understandably but accidentally adopted the wrong word to describe the system they were creating. They used the word government. They said, what kind of government are we going to build here? And in the founding document, you say it's government does this, government does that. Well, think about it. What is the proper function of government? By definition, it is to govern. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. That's a mistake. The Founding Fathers used the word government because that was the word that was in use at the time. That's what they always had. The world had governments. People were always governed by the state. And so they just adopted the word because that was it. But what they created was not a government at all. They created what I would suggest should have been called a protectorate. They created a state that was designed not to govern the people, but to protect the people, to protect their lives, liberty, and property, nothing more. And that's what they created. And I believe that if they had the foresight to have used the word protectorate in all of their writings, then all of the school children for generations thereafter would be talking about this thing called a protectorate. And the very use of the word would trigger off the definition of what is the proper function of the state. And you see what an assist that would be. So I suggest that when we all get together and do this second model, we're going to use a different word. Let's use the word protectorate. So now I'll take my Constitution hat off and put my money hat back on. And I know that money is a topic that's very much in the minds of many people. And as you folks know, I'm here in Austin primarily to do a one-day seminar called A Crash Course on Money. And I hope that many of you will be able to attend it. I'll be talking about things in that seminar entirely different from my topic here this evening. The motivation for most people coming to the seminar is that they want to have an idea, a better idea of what they can do to protect themselves in this economic perfect storm that is approaching. In fact, it's not really approaching anymore. We used to talk about, see those clouds over there on the horizon, those big black clouds? You know, one of these days we're going to have a real problem. Well, now the darn things are right overhead, and it's not really approaching. It's here. We're beginning to feel the winds and the rain and the snow and all of that right now. And people want to know, how can they protect themselves in the short run? How can they protect their assets? Because you know there's going to be a lot of inflation ahead. We'll talk about inflation versus deflation and what sectors will be affected, in my opinion at least, which will be affected by deflation for a while and which ones will be subject to massive inflation. We'll talk about what you can do about it and what investments there may be that are still viable in this crisis period. And most importantly, we'll be talking about how to repair the system so it won't be just a question of survival, but how to make a system that will benefit our children and our grandchildren as well. I think any discussion of these issues that doesn't have the long view of history is very, very deficient. And if we don't look at the system, you know, if we have all the money in the world but we lose the freedom to enjoy it, we've made a huge mistake. To me, it's like counting your money on the sinking Titanic. You know, you don't get the whole picture. But anyway, tonight, I realize that there are a lot of people who may not have been familiar with my work on the Federal Reserve System. And so what I'm going to do is take a condensation of my original talk that I've given so many times over the years on the Federal Reserve System, called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and condense it down into a much smaller, manageable segment, and then follow it with a short overview of what I think the situation looks like today, what's happened since the book was published, and kind of a brief view of where I think we're headed. And then I think we'll probably be out of time. And you may remember that those of you who've heard what I call my original recipe talk, generally it was called The Creature from Jekyll Island, just like the book. But in reality, it had a different title, that at least I intended it to be known as under a different title, which was An Appearance of the Fourth Kind. Somebody giggled or hummed on that, so you know where I'm going with this now. And that statement is based on a quotation taken from an obscure philosopher by the name of Epictetus, who lived in I think it was the 3rd century BC in an obscure kingdom called Phrygia. And he was a philosopher, and some of his writings survived and have been translated. And I ran across one of the most amazing quotations I've ever read attributed to Epictetus. And this is it. Epictetus said, "Appearances are of 4 kinds. Things either are as they appear to be, or they neither are nor appear to be, or they are but do not appear to be, or they are not and yet appear to be." I know everybody's got that. It's amazing how confusing that sounds when in reality it's just a simple concept. You know, I figured that if Epictetus were alive today, he'd probably be the chairman of the Federal Reserve System or Harvard professor of money theory or something like that. What he said was pretty simple, but he made it confusing with his explanation. What he said was appearances are of 4 kinds. Things either are or they aren't. There's 2. And then regardless of which they are, they can appear to be the opposite. So there's 4. Why didn't he just say so? No. Well, because he was practicing for a career in banking. So anyway, the appearance of the 4th kind was, as you remember, is those things which are not and yet appear to be. And that's the best explanation I could think of at the time for the Federal Reserve System, because we all expect it to be a government agency. It's not. We expect it to be in the interest of the American people. It's not. All of these things that people think about the Federal Reserve System is a complete reversal of its reality. So that'll be half of my presentation today, but I must tell you that the most important part of this talk, I must not forget, it's the joke section. And I'm going to tell you 2 genie jokes. I like genie jokes. And the first one is the story of this young fellow that was going through the alley, and he came across a bottle which was all dirty, but he rubbed it off and found these fancy decorations on it and pulled the cork out. And you know what happened? The smoke came out of the bottle, and there was the genie that appeared right in front of him. And he said, the genie said, "You have released me from my prison of the ages, and now I will grant you 3 wishes." And the kid said, "Gosh, a real genie going to give me 3 wishes?" And the genie said, "Yes, whatever you wish is my command." So the kid said, "Let's see, genie, I've always wanted a basketball. I want a basketball." The genie said, "Vroom," and there was this basketball in the kid's hands. The kid said, "Oh, this is wonderful, genie. I want a bicycle." "Vroom," said the genie, and there was a brand new bicycle. The kid said, "Oh, this is wonderful. You know, genie, I'm thirsty. Make me a malted." "Vroom," he said, "you're a malted." Okay, second one is even worse. A fellow walks into a bar, and he has an ostrich with him. They go up to the bar, and the ostrich right along with them. They both sit on bar stools. And the bartender, of course, is amazed. He's never seen an ostrich in his bar before. So he walked up to the fellow on the ostrich and said, well, what can I do for you? Would you like a drink? And the guy said, yeah, I'd like a drink. He said, I'd like a vodka martini, please. And the bartender started to leave, but the guy turned to the ostrich and he said, would you like something to drink? What would you like? And to the bartender's amazement, the ostrich turned to the guy and spoke and said, oh, whatever you like is fine with me. Whatever you do, I like it, so a vodka martini would be fine. Well, the bartender was really amazed at this, an ostrich and a talking ostrich at that. So he went and got the 2 vodka martinis, and a few minutes later came back when the drinks were getting toward the bottom, and he said, would you like another? And the fellow said, no, 1 is enough. How much do I owe you? And the bartender pulled out the receipt, and including the tax, it was $14.44. And he said, that's the bill. Well, the guy reached in his pocket and pulled out all of the money he had, laid it out on the bar, counted it out. It was $14.44, right to the penny. Amazing. And then they left. Well, the next day, the guy comes back with the same ostrich into the same bar, and the bartender said, well, would you like your vodka martini today? And he said, no, today I'd like a different drink. I think I'll have a whiskey sour. And he turned to the ostrich and said, would you like a drink? The ostrich said, oh, yes, I would. I think a whiskey sour would be fine. You know, I like whatever you drink. Whatever you do is fine with me. I always like that. So they had a whiskey sour. The same thing. A little bit later, the bartender came back and said, would you like another? No was the answer. How much do I owe you? The bartender looked at the tab and said, well, this one is $12.22, including tax. And so the fellow reached in his pocket, pulled out everything he had, laid it on the bar, and there it was, $12.22, right to the penny. Amazing again. Well, this went on every day for the whole week. Each day, the fellow and the ostrich came in. Each day they had a different drink. Each day it was a different tab. And each day, no matter what it was, the fellow reached in his pocket, and he always had the exact right amount of money. So finally, at the end of the week, the bartender turned to the fellow and he said, you know, I've got to ask you a question. He said, I'm totally amazed by what I see here, a talking ostrich in my bar and all that, but the thing that really amazes me, how is it that no matter what the bill is, you reach in your pocket and you pull out everything you have, you spread it out, and you've got the exact amount of money to the penny? How do you do that? The guy said, well, let me tell you a little story. He said, I was walking through an alley one day, and I came across a bottle, and it was all dirty, and I wiped it off, and I saw these fancy decorations, pulled the cork out, and out came the smoke. And there was a genie. And the genie said, you have released me from my prison of the ages, and now I will grant you 2 wishes. Well, 2 this time. It's not as good as 3, but anyway, 2 is pretty good. And so the fellow says, I get 2 wishes, no matter what I want. The genie says, yes, your wish is my command. So he said, all right, genie, my first wish is, let's see, I think, yes, I know what it's going to be. I would like to be able to afford, no matter what it is I want in life, I want to be able to have enough money to buy it. Whether it's a drink or a trip around the world or a yacht, no matter what it is, I want to be able to afford it. And he said, the genie went, vroom, I grant you your wish. And he said to the bartender, ever since that day, no matter what I've ordered, no matter how expensive or inexpensive it is, I reach in my pocket, and it's a miracle. I always have the right amount of money. And he said, the other wish I gave to the genie was this. He said, genie, I've always wanted a chick with long eyelashes and long legs who always agreed with everything I wanted to do. Now, I bet you'll never believe it, but those jokes have a connection with what I want to talk about tonight. And the moral to those stories is that you ought to be very, very careful what you wish for, because if you get it, it may not be what you thought it was going to be. And that's my theme tonight. And I'm going to take this presentation, as I said, a little condensation of the old original recipe talk on the Federal Reserve, plus a little update at the end. And I decided to condense a summary of it down into 2 sound bites. You know, when you're traveling around and every once in a while you get a chance to go on the radio and even more rarely, somebody from a television station will say, well, we hear you're going to be in town tonight. Would you like to be on the local news? And you say, yeah, of course. And they say, well, we'll give you about 10 seconds to summarize your 90-minute speech. So you get to be pretty good on condensing things down, you know. So I decided to pretend like I was being given about 10 or 15 seconds to describe each of these two parts of my presentation, and I concocted these sound bites. So you better listen carefully to this. Part number one. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created because Americans made a wish to the government genie to control the banks on behalf of the people. But what they got was a banking cartel that now controls the government. Okay, that's statement number one. Statement number two. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Now, I've just summarized it all, so we can all go home now. That's everything I want to say, and so the rest of the time will be spent primarily just to filling in some of the details. So I think a good place to begin is take a look at the book titled The Creature from Jekyll Island. I know this is common ground for many of you, but I hope there are many here that don't know what that's all about. What's The Creature from Jekyll Island all about? And I must admit that I had some fun with that title because it has kind of a mysterious sound to it. It sounds like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or it may sound like the creature from the Black Lagoon. And I thought if anybody saw the book in a window of a bookstore, they might get curious, thinking it was a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that. But all kidding aside, the title really does have a great deal of significance because Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia, and it was on that island back in 1910, 3 years before the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, which was 1913. But back in 1910, the Federal Reserve System was created in all of its important features. It was designed and created on Jekyll Island in 1910. And when I began to research this subject, I realized that Jekyll Island in those days was privately owned. It was owned by a small group of billionaires from New York, people like John D. Rockefeller, people like J.P. Morgan, their business associates and their friends. This was a privately owned island. It was a resort island, and it's where their families went to spend the cold winter months. And they had beautiful mansions there. They called them cottages, but you can visit the island today. I hope you will when you're in the area, because those cottages, so-called, are beautiful examples of architecture from that period of history. And they've been most of them anyway, have been restored and maintained by the state of Georgia now. So it's almost like a shrine to these people. But the key structure on the island is the clubhouse, as they called it. In fact, the name of that island and this association which they owned was called the Jekyll Island Club. And they have a beautiful clubhouse, which is now run by the Marriott Hotels. And you can go in there and have a nice lunch. In fact, I was there just a few months ago for a meeting and checked into the hotel and got to stay in one of the rooms, nice little room. It's quite eloquent for the time. But remember, the really big families had their own mansions on the island. But this is a place where visitors could have come. So you can visit the island today. And if you do that, and you're leaving the clubhouse, and you go out it's kind of the back door, just before you go out the back door, turn to your left, and you'll see another door goes to a side room. And on the door, there's a plaque. And it says, the Federal Reserve Room. And if you go in that room, you'll see pictures on the wall of the 7 men who actually created the Federal Reserve System in that room, in that building back in 1910. And I found that very curious to discover that the Federal Reserve System, which I was given the impression when I was in school was a government agency, I thought that should be created in Washington, D.C. I thought it was strange that here it was on a private island created in this room, And then I discovered what was even more amazing is that the conditions of this meeting were secret. A great deal of secrecy prevailed. The men were told to arrive, well, back up a little bit. The story begins in November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich took his private railroad car, a private railroad car, if you can imagine, like having your private Boeing jet today, to the New Jersey Railroad Station. And there it was in readiness for the arrival of himself and 6 other men who were instructed to come to the station, the train station, separately, not to be seen together that night, not to dine together that night, to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. See, in those days, the reporters used to hang out at the train station because before the era of aircraft, all the dignitaries, all the political figures, all the superstars had to travel by train in and out of New York, and that's where they went. And so they had their version of the paparazzi hanging out in the train station to get a picture and an interview and a statement from all of these dignitaries. And so they were instructed to avoid newspaper reporters at all costs. One of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case, just in case he had been stopped by a reporter and asked where he was going. He was prepared to say that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And we find out from his biographer, later years, they wrote about this event, and from his children, who also wrote about it, that this man never fired a gun in his life. That was not his shotgun. He had borrowed it from a friend just so he could carry it and use it as a kind of a deception in case he had been asked where he's going. So that was amazing. Once on board the train, the men were told to address each other when talking in the privacy of this railroad car, to address each other with first names only, to avoid using their last names. And in the case of 2 of these men, they dropped their first names completely and adopted code names in the privacy of the car. And I thought that was most strange. And then we find in an article that was published in the Saturday Evening Post, written by one of those participants, he explained why that was. He said they were concerned that the servants on board the train would find out who all of these people were together, and that they were spending some time together and going to Jekyll Island. And although the servants knew the identity of their employer, Senator Aldrich, of course, and might have known the identities of possibly one of the others, they didn't know them all. And it was the leaking of information about all of these people being together that they were concerned about, because they thought that once that information got into the real world out there and possibly be picked up in the press, then the whole purpose of this meeting would be subverted. So that's the kind of secrecy that was brought about this meeting. Even when they got to Jekyll Island, there was 2 nights and a day journey, 1,000 miles to the south. They got off the train, they took a ferry boat across the inland straits to the island and then to this clubhouse. And when they got there, the normal group of employees who worked at the clubhouse had all been dismissed and replaced by temporary employees for exactly the same reason. They didn't want any of the employees leaking information about all of these important people coming together. So there's more to it than that, but when I discovered the secrecy, I couldn't put it down. I thought, you know, when things are done in secret, there's usually something to hide. And I was curious about what it was, and that's what really got me going on my research. I wanted to find out what it was that they were trying to hide. And I did find out, and I wrote about it, and I'll tell you in just a minute what it was. It's not that hard to figure out, mainly because it's right in your face. It's like the purloined letter. It's easy to overlook because it's right there in plain view. All right, first we need to take a look at who these men were. I've already mentioned one of them, and he was Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was the guy with the railroad car, a very wealthy person in his own right. He was probably the most important and powerful political figure of the time, next to the President of the United States. He was the Republican whip in the Senate, but more important for our discussion this evening, he was the chairman of what they called the National Monetary Commission. The National Monetary Commission was a special committee of Congress which was given the task of drafting legislation to be considered by Congress to break the grip of the money trust. Now that's a phrase that's taken right from the newspapers of the period. I remember when doing all of this research back in those days, this was before the internet, can you imagine a period like that? And to get these news references, it was necessary to go down to some big library. I spent days and days, if not months, and possibly years if I add it all together, at the Los Angeles Library in their microfilm department. You know those big machines, you sit there all day long, you turn the crank, and the microfilm goes through the machine and is projected onto a big table. And you can just whiz, you see the whizzing before your eyes, all the history of the United States just whizzing by day by day by day. You feel like you're God looking down from heaven, watching history go rushing by. But you get pretty good after a while. You start looking for phrases and topics, and all of a sudden I see something go by. Whoops, back up. What was that? Oh yeah, break the grip of the money trust is a phrase that came up over and over and over again, especially on the editorial pages of the New York Times. And it turns out that in that period, the American people were very concerned about the concentration of financial power into the hands of a small group of very powerful investment firms and banks in Wall Street. And they called that, in those days, the money trust. And so there was this populist demand to have some legislation that's going to take control of this financial industry and put it in the hands of Congress, so that Congress, which theoretically represented the will of the people, therefore the people indirectly could control the banking system, you see. So the idea was that you couldn't trust those big bad bankers, but you certainly could trust those nice, trustworthy politicians. You know, that was kind of the built-in theory behind that. But that was the pressure of the time, and the whole purpose, or I should say the main purpose, of the Federal Reserve Act was to break the grip of the money trust and to prevent all kinds of bad things happening in the economy that had been going on previously, like bank failures. See, the banks weren't being bailed out in those days. They just failed. And people did lose their money, the depositors that had money in those fraudulent banks. But the banks went out of business. They weren't propped up and left intact to do the same thing over and over and over and over again, you see. And so that was very disconcerting, that banks were going out of business because there were runs on the bank and people were discovering that the promises the banks had made about the deposits they held were lies. And so when depositors find out that their bank doesn't have all the money they deposited in the bank, they get very nervous about that. And so they line up outside and said, I want my money. And when the banks see that lineup, they say, uh-oh, we don't have enough money to pay all these people. We've spent it or loaned it or something. And so they declare a bank holiday and they close their doors. Well, that sort of thing was going on, and the American people said, well, we got to have our Congress put a stop to this. And so the purpose of the National Monetary Commission was to explore legislation which was going to put an end to all of that kind of economic catastrophe in the system, and to defend the American consumer and to stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar and all of those things that the Federal Reserve System has never done. But that's what the whole idea was. And so back to Aldrich. He was chairman of that committee, and he was an associate, a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. So it's sort of in the family, as you can see. Being the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., that means he was the grandfather of our former vice president. You may remember Nelson Rockefeller. If you remember his middle name, it was Aldrich, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. And so he was named after his famous grandfather. So with those connections, he was just the kind of a guy to break the grip of the money trust. The next person on board was Abraham Piatt Andrew. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time. Doesn't tell you too much about him, because it makes him sound like he's a political appointee, which he was, but it makes him sound like he's a bureaucrat. Actually, he's a banker. He comes from a family of banking, and he had strong banking connections, which is the reason he had been appointed as the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. The same thing that's going on today. If you notice, the Treasury secretaries all come from banking circles, so do the assistant secretaries and so forth. So although you get the feeling that they represent the political side of the picture, they don't. They're all bankers on no matter which side you look. And it certainly was true in those days. The third man on board was Frank Vanderlip. Now, he's the guy that was a prolific writer and wrote the article that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, also wrote a book in later years. And he was president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the most powerful of all the banks at that time. And as such, he represented the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Very powerful, very large investment firm. The next person on board was Henry Davison. He was senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Next was Charles Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York, another one of the giants. Benjamin Strong was on board. He was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and he later became the first actual acting head of the Federal Reserve System when it was formed 3 years later. And finally, there was Paul Warburg. Probably, at least in my view, he was probably the most important person there from a technical point of view because he was born in Europe, came from a banking family there, he's a naturalized American citizen, and he understood European banking very well. That was his origin, his family, business. And although he was an American citizen now, he was the only one that really understood the intricacies of what they call central banking as it developed in Europe and as it became exemplified in the Bank of England. And he was really the technical expert. But he was a full partner in this country. He was a full partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He represented the wealth of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. He was the brother to Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. And, of course, he was the real Daddy Warbucks. Those of you who are familiar with Little Orphan Annie, remember the cartoon caricature of Daddy Warbucks? That was modeled after Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg, Daddy Warbucks. And if you look at a photograph of Paul Warburg, you'll see the dead resemblance. It's a dead ringer for the caricature figure of Daddy Warbucks. And everybody at the time, I am told, knew that the caricature was of Paul Warburg. Now, those are the men that traveled on board that private railroad car and went to Jekyll Island and created the Federal Reserve System to break the grip of the money trust. Now, according to the estimates of the time, published in papers like the New York Times, these people represented, through the wealth that they held themselves directly, and also from the wealth they controlled indirectly through the investment firms which they represented here and in Europe, approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Now, that's not my estimate. That comes from observers of the time writing about these men and the groups which they represented. Now, the question that should come to the mind of any healthy skeptic is, did it really happen that way? You might suspect that maybe I've distorted some of these facts just to make a story good. But unfortunately, it did happen exactly that way, if not even more so. And although if this were my original presentation, I would take some time to read to you somewhat lengthy quotations from the participants of this meeting themselves, who confirmed all of the details. I just have to ask you, if you have any skepticism about this at all, please take a little time and check out the references in The Creature from Jekyll Island. You'll see these quotations there, and you'll see the references, and you'll realize that they do come from the original sources themselves. These are not observers talking. These are participants. And in particular, you'll find Vanderlip talking about the elements of secrecy and why they had to keep this secret, and the fact that they were worried about the servants on board the train. And all of those things are spelled out by Vanderlip in great detail, almost word for word, in what I mentioned just a moment ago. But we come finally, and most importantly, to the question of why this secrecy. And by now I think you probably have figured it out. And Vanderlip himself answers that question in this famous article that I've been referring to, which, by the way, later was expanded and was published in the form of a book. You can go to any well-stocked library today and get Vanderlip's book, and you'll read this quotation. He said, "If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have had no chance whatever of passage by Congress." Of course. The scam would have been out in the open. Here was a bill to be supposedly to break the grip of the money trust, and had the American people realized it was drafted by the money trust itself, they might have asked a few questions. And so that's why they did it on Jekyll Island, and that's why they lied about going to this meeting for years afterwards. If they had been asked, "Did you go to a meeting on Jekyll Island? Did you write the banking bill?" They all said, "No, of course not." Had the phrase been popular in those days, they would have said, "What kind of a conspiracy theory is that?" You know? Then they denied it. And it wasn't until after the Federal Reserve System had been passed into law, and then a period of some time after that, and finally the American public began to consider it as a great American institution, then they began to talk openly about their role. And in fact, it became almost humorous, because it seemed like they were competing with each other for the title of being the most influential person at the meeting. And it was interesting for me to follow this over a period of about a 10 or 12-year period and see how their attitudes changed from total denial to finally claiming that they were not only there, but they were probably the most important person there. You know? And so, as I said a moment ago, you can go to any well-stocked library and learn all of this, but you will not find it, I guarantee you, you will not find it in the textbooks of America. And you certainly will not find it mentioned in any form in the major media of this country. Now, something else can be learned by looking at that meeting on Jekyll Island. I think everything we need to know of importance today in understanding what is happening in Washington with all of these bailout programs and all these stimulus packages and the creation of unfathomable amounts of money, everything that we need to know about why that's happening and who's doing it can be understood better if we really just pause for a moment and study what happened on Jekyll Island, because that's the genesis of it. Everything was put in motion there. That's where the clock was wound up and the ticking started. And one of the things you will notice, and it took me quite a while, by the way, I was looking at this for quite a while during my research until finally it just dawned on me. My gosh, I said, look at these people, these names I just mentioned. They're all sitting around a table on Jekyll Island, and they're coming to an agreement of some kind. Doesn't that seem strange? Because here we are, the Rothschilds represented, the Rockefellers, Kuhn-Loeb Company, J.P. Morgan, the Warburgs, European, American. And yes, it's very strange because, you see, these were competitors. Prior to this point in history, these are the giant financial firms that were fighting against each other for dominance in the world markets. Blood all over the battlefield in Paris and London and New York. And now they're sitting around like gentlemen and coming to an agreement of some kind. And finally the bells begin to go off, and you realize that this happened precisely at the time of American history that some historians refer to as the dawning of the cartel. And it is true. Prior to the turn of the century, America had gone from virtually a wilderness, a frontier land, to one of the greatest output industrial societies the world has ever seen in a very short period of time, primarily, in my opinion, because of free enterprise competition. Competition, freedom, is what did it. You had to produce a better product or a better service at a lower price. If you could do that, you could make a lot of money, and everybody wanted to make money, so they competed for product and service. Then, after some of these most successful enterprises got to the top, people like the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, now they're at the top of the mountain. Now they don't want competition anymore. Because if you allow competition to remain in place, who knows, there might be somebody coming up that'll knock them off the top of the mountain. And it was John D. Rockefeller himself who was quoted by all of his biographers as saying, competition is a sin. And he believed it, now that he was on top. And he'd spent most of his later years in preventing competition in one way or another. Buy it up, squeeze it out, ruthless tactics. But the most effective tactic of all is to join forces with your competition and to create a cartel, if it's big enough. And so we saw at about the turn of the century, many of these giant corporations beginning to come together to form cartel arrangements where they would no longer compete. They would say to each other basically, well, all right, we're the giants, we're at the top. It's okay to have 2 or 3 of us in the field, but no more. We'll work together. And so they began to come to agreements where they would fix prices or establish geographical areas so they wouldn't compete there. They would share patents and processes and so forth. And gradually all of these individual companies, although they remained separate in ownership and management, began to eliminate competition between themselves until finally, over a period of time, they emerged as essentially one company, or at least one industry, dominated by a cartel. And there was no longer competition, which means that the consumer had to pay a higher price for the same product or service. This was going on everywhere, and lo and behold, it jumps right off of the history page when you look at that and you realize that the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. And that is what was created there. It is no different than a banana cartel or a sugar cartel or an oil cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. And the brilliance of these guys is that they knew that it's always difficult to keep members of the cartel in line. Just think about it for a minute. Supposing you're running an oil cartel, and you're crossing national boundaries, and you've got people in Mexico and people in the Middle East, and you've got countries everywhere in the world. They all got their oil wells, and you say, let's get together, guys, so we can all fix the price or limit the supply to force the price up, whatever your decision is. And everybody agrees. Great. Now, a year down the line, one of the members of the cartel, let's say Mexico, says, you know, we got a lot of oil here. We're not pumping as much as we could. I think if we lowered our price a little bit and broke the cartel agreement, we could make more money than even we are now making it through the cartel. And they may decide to break the cartel agreement. Well, what are the other cartel members going to do about it? Nothing they can do about it. Well, yes, they could hire some jackals, and they could, do that sort of thing. They could get involved in assassination attempts and that kind of thing, which happens. But basically, there's nothing they can do about it legally unless they bring government into it. Now, if you bring government into your cartel agreement, and you take the cartel agreement and make it law, now the government is your enforcer. First time I ran into that years ago, I saw the same thing happen in the Midwest in the dairy cartel. They call it the Dairy Association. The dairy producers in the Midwest, I've forgotten the year on this, but I think it was early 1960s, were concerned because some of the dairies were selling milk too cheaply. They were undercutting the market. And the big producers said, no, we don't like this. How are we going to keep these guys from undercutting us? And so they got the politicians into the picture. And they began to promote laws in all the various states called fair trade laws. Doesn't that sound nice? The object was to fix the price of milk, to make it illegal to charge any price for milk except what was decided by the group. That's a cartel agreement. You couldn't raise or lower your price. It was all fixed. And they said, well, we have to do this because we don't want people charging too much for milk. babies need milk. And we don't want people having malnutrition because they can't get milk. And so this is a humanitarian effort. They always couch their decisions in humanitarian purposes. And so they got all of the dum-dums to pass these so-called fair trade laws, which in the net effect was to raise the price of milk throughout the Midwest. And those undercutting the price were no longer able to do it legally. This is exactly what happens with all cartels, and you've noticed all of them tend to want to go into partnership with government for exactly that reason. And so the brilliance of this group on Jekyll Island is that they took their cartel agreement and they took it to Washington. And they convinced these eggheads in Washington to take an eraser and erase the top of the page which said cartel agreement, and then they typed in the words Federal Reserve Act. And they passed it into law. And now, all the banks, new and old, must obey. You and I must obey. Nobody can escape the cartel agreement or we go to prison. Now you understand, right with that statement, one of the most fundamental facts of the Federal Reserve System. And the reason it appears to be a government agency is because it has the force of law behind it. And if you violate its terms, you can go to prison. And so everybody said, well, nobody can put you in prison except the government, right? So it must be government. When in fact it's a private cartel, ladies and gentlemen, which has simply gotten the Congress of the United States to put its seal of approval on it and to pass the cartel agreement into law. Now you understand the Federal Reserve System far better than any graduate from Harvard, because they do not teach this at Harvard at all. So we learn that by studying what happened on Jekyll Island. And now, well, we'll come to that in a minute, and you can see what's happening in Washington today, and all of a sudden it makes more sense, because we realize we're dealing with a cartel, and what is the purpose of a cartel? It's not to protect the employment rate in the country. Purpose of all cartels is the same, and that's to further the objective of the members of the cartel, period. If Greenspan or Bernanke were to come before some congressional hearing and they were to ask him, well, Mr. Bernanke, why did you raise interest rates this week? It wouldn't go over too well if he said, well, we figured we could get away with it. That wouldn't go over too good. No, he had said, well, we're trying to cool inflation because we want to stimulate the economy. We don't want the economy to go out of whack. We did it for you folks, in other words. We're good citizens, and that's why we did it. So you have to be aware of the trickery and the sophistry of their explanations. And it's much easier if you always remember that the chairman of the Federal Reserve System is not the key man. He's an employee. He gets a paycheck, and he takes orders, and his bosses are the heads of the largest banks in New York. When Bernanke speaks, he speaks for the banks, period. And then once you understand that, then it all becomes a lot simpler to unravel. All right. The last thing I want to do is talk about the Mandrake mechanism, because this is something that if you don't know about it, you need to know about it. I call it the Mandrake mechanism because it's named after that comic book character of the 1940s that I used to read all the time, Mandrake the Magician. He was a guy that had this big black cape, and he could wave the cape, and all kinds of things would materialize out of nothing in his cape. That boom, it would be there. And then he could wave it over here and it would all disappear. So he could bring things into existence and out of existence magically. And I thought, this is how they do it at the Federal Reserve System. This is how they create money. And we're talking now about how money is created in the United States and now throughout most of the world. The Mandrake mechanism. It starts with Congress. Remember, this is a partnership now. We have Congress involved, we have the politicians involved, and the bankers involved, each for their mutual benefit. So let's take a brief look at what is the benefit to each of these groups. And we'll start with the politician side, the Congress. The politicians need more money, always, than they're willing to take in taxes. Spending money gets them elected, but taxing their taxpayers and their voters gets them unelected. And so the trick for most politicians has always been, how do you provide benefits without increasing taxes? And the answer is very simple if you're a politician. You just borrow it. It's just sort of like with an individual breadwinner having to make the same decision. If you want to spend more than you earn, how do you do it? Well, you can. If you want to, you can borrow it and live pretty high for a little while. And then, of course, the day of reckoning arrives, and then you lose a lot, maybe everything. But with Congress, the day of reckoning doesn't really arrive, because these guys know, because they have the power of government behind them, they never have to repay that loan. It's not a genuine loan at all. It has the appearance of a loan. They promise to pay you back, but as we'll see in a moment, they have no intention of ever paying back these loans. Not one of those guys ever thought about paying back a loan. Here's how it works. They need another $1 million today for some welfare program or some vote-buying scheme, some medical program that they're working on, and they need lots of money. And so they borrow money from the private sector, and they say, well, we'll borrow it for 1 year, and we'll pay it back a year from now, plus interest. So far, so good. But a year from now arrives. Now these guys in Congress still don't have enough money to pay their current bills, much less pay back the old loans they made a year ago, plus interest. So how do they handle that? Well, it's easy. They just borrow some more, this time enough to cover the old loan, plus interest, plus to cover the new spending projects that are underfunded. And so the phenomena we see of the national debt going up each year is well known to everybody. These guys, as I say, have no intention of ever paying that back. They just keep borrowing more and more and more. But notice that through, I don't know if you've already followed this, where does this money come from that the government is borrowing? We know that individuals will go and buy government bonds, right? We know that corporations buy government bonds. We know that investment funds buy government bonds. And we know that foreign countries buy government bonds, all because they figure it's a good investment that's going to be paid back, plus interest, no matter what. Because it's backed by what they call the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that makes everybody feel kind of warm inside, you know. What is better than the full faith and credit of the United States government? Well, until you think about it, what does that mean? That means the politicians are saying, we promise to pay you back everything we borrow from you plus interest. By golly, we will do it. If we have to tax from you everything you have to do it, we will do it. In other words, you're the backing yourself. The American people is the full faith and credit, not of the government, but the full faith of the people of the United States. And they're going to pay all of that back, but not the government, not the politicians at all. Anyway, so they borrow it from people or institutions. That's my main point here. And that money already exists, does it not? People have saved it, and they buy bonds with it. So consider that for a moment. This is money that's already out there, so where's this inflation come from? It doesn't come from that at all, because no new money is created. It's just being turned over as loans and interest and so forth. But now, the truth of the matter is that they never can borrow enough in that fashion. There's always a shortfall. And it's the shortfall that gets interesting. When I started to do this research, the shortfall was about 7%. In other words, 7% of the money that the government needed back in 1994, 1993, when I was looking at the statistics, they could not borrow from the private sector at all. It wasn't there. They would have had to raise interest rates considerably to attract that additional 7%. They did not want to raise interest rates. And so what do? Well, they just walked down the street to the Federal Reserve System. Now, I'll put a pause on that for a second. Today, I don't know what the shortfall is because I have not seen the statistics. They're not publishing the statistics. Can you imagine that? But my guess is that the shortfall today is running about 30 to 40%. And I'm thinking that the way things are currently going, that probably by this time next year it could be 50, 60, maybe 70% shortfall. So where does that shortfall come from? Back to our little scenario. Let's say that the Treasury official walks down the street to the Federal Reserve building. And he walks in there, and the president of the Federal Reserve branch says, good evening, sir, or good morning, sir. Won't you come in? We've been expecting you. Because they arrive there every day. They want money. He says, come into my office. So, now, Mind you, this is all fictional. It doesn't really happen this way. These loans are made quickly with a phone call or maybe an email or some kind of a protected internet exchange, and it's all done with keystrokes on a computer today. But anyway, just to keep it clear in our minds, imagine the Treasury official walks into the Federal Reserve building and said, "Sit down, sir, how much money do you want today?" And the Treasury official would say, "Well, another $1 trillion today would be just about right. Get us going till noon tomorrow." And so Federal Reserve's guy says, "All right, no problem, sir." And he opens up this big desk drawer, pulls out the big black checkbook, and he writes a check to the United States government for $1 trillion, signs it, hands it to the Treasury official. "Thank you very much." Out he goes, down the street, deposits the $1 trillion check into the bank account of the government, and now the government has $1 trillion. Didn't have to come from the private sector at all. Came from the Federal Reserve System. Now, the question is, where did that money come from? What account did the Federal Reserve have? Who put the money in there? And the amazing answer is that there is no account, there's no money, there's nothing. That money is just created out of thin air. This comes from heaven. And, if you and I were to do this, we would go to jail very fast, but they can do it because Congress wants them to do it. Think about that. The politicians really don't ever have to worry about what anything costs. They can vote trillions and trillions of dollars for health care, Social Security benefits, for stimulus packages. They can conduct wars, 97 wars all at once, whatever it costs. Do they care? Why should they care? Whatever the shortfall is, they can go to the Federal Reserve System, and by agreement, this is a partnership, by a partnership agreement, the Fed will create that money out of thin air and give it to the government in the pretext of loaning it to them. But they didn't really loan it, they just created it for the government. It's the same mechanism that in the old days would be done by turning on the printing presses. Just printing the money. Well, there's too much of it now to work that way. People are used to checkbook money now and computer money, so hauling all of that paper money around would be very inconvenient. So it never sees the light of paper money. Less than 3% of all the money in circulation is in coin and currency. All the rest is digital. But it's money nevertheless. And so that's just created out of thin air, and it goes into the economy. And the politicians don't have to worry about it at all. So that's why they're in it. Now, let's take it to the next step. See why the banks are in it. Let's take $10,000. No, let's make it simpler. Let's take $1,000 of that huge amount of money that was created for the Fed and trace it. Let's say it's given to a fellow that delivers our mail. The postal worker gets a $1,000 check from the federal government, and now he's got it in his hand, nothing better than a government check. It's good money. So he takes it down the street to his bank, the private bank where his account is, and he makes a deposit into his checking account. Now that money is out of the Federal Reserve government side of the partnership and into the private banking side of the partnership as a deposit into the banking system. Here's what happens. If I were the president of that bank, I could stand up in front of the room there where all the people are lined up at the windows, and I could say, "Attention everybody, excuse me, I'm the president of the bank, and I want to tell you we have some good news. This gentleman over here just deposited $1,000 into our venerable bank, and we now have money to loan." And that's good news because a lot of people are in the banks to borrow money, and they know that the more money that the banks have to loan, usually the lower the interest rate. So it's all good news. But perhaps this lady over here would say, "Did you say $1,000? "Yeah." So, "Well, I guess you can't help me because I want to buy a used car to take the kids to school, and I need $9,000. I need to borrow $9,000. And I guess you can't help me. I'll go somewhere else." And if I were a really good bank president, I would say, "Excuse me, ma'am, don't worry about that. Just take a seat at my desk. I'll be with you in a minute." And if she would say, "But you said $1,000 and I want $9, you can't loan me $9 on the basis of $9 on the basis of $1, and I would say, "Do you want the money or not?" And the truth of the matter is that after you consider all the bells and whistles and all the complicated accounting and all the delaying actions, you get it all condensed down to one formula. The answer is yes, I can loan $9,000 to her on the basis of the $1,000 from him, and when I'm all done, I still got his $1,000 in the vault. That's called fractional reserve banking. And it's the way banks have been operated for hundreds of years. They don't have to have anything in the vault to loan you money. They just create it out of nothing in terms of a ratio. Fractional reserve means they only have to have a fraction of the amount that they loan. And the Federal Reserve System has had for many years a fraction formula. It says that the banks can loan any amount of money provided they have 10% of that amount in reserve in their vault or on their accounting records as a reserve of some kind. So as a bank president, all I have to do is take his $1,000 and put it under a column on a piece of paper, and I write at the top, says reserve. Okay, $1,000 reserve, that's good. Now let's see, I can loan $10,000 and still have 10% reserve. So I can now create the other $9,000 out of thin air. That's basically how it works when you boil all the mechanisms down to a simple formula. That means that for every $1 trillion created out of nothing for the federal government, by the time it gets into the private sector, into commercial banking, up to an additional $9 trillion can be created out of nothing and pushed into the economy in the form of private loans. And this is where the real action is in the American economy. It's not in what they loan to the federal government, but it's in what that triggers and it makes possible to loan to private investors and corporate investors and institutions. So you can see now how money comes into existence. It's not a bad deal. I've often thought to myself, why didn't I think of that? So notice, though, there's a difference here. When the money is created out of nothing for the federal government, they use that money for their own expenditures. When the money is created out of nothing for the banking side of this partnership, the banks don't use it for their purposes. They lend it to people like us. And we pay interest on it. So why do they do this? Duh. Interest on nothing. Think about that. The banks are always saying, well, we've got these reserves, and they say, we only charge 3% on our reserves, but they don't tell you about the other 9 times that. Whatever interest rates the banks tell you they're collecting on their reserves, mentally multiply it by 8 or 9, and now you're looking at the true rate of return on what they actually got, because they charge interest on the things that they don't have as well, and you can't tell the difference between the two. So what's the net effect of all of this? You know, you might say, jokingly, as I do, I said, why didn't I think of that? I think I should have been a banker. I should get my kids to go into banking and all of that sort of thing. But, you know, there's a consequence to this. When this money is created out of nothing, the money supply expands. Now, we don't have time to go into the other side of it. The money supply does contract, too. I'll be talking about that in my seminar, by the way. But there is a contraction side to this equation, which is important to keep in mind. But the net effect, after the contraction is subtracted, out of the expansion, you always historically have more expansion than contraction. So you have this expanding money supply. It's always been that way throughout history. Can you imagine why it shouldn't be? Here are people with the ability to create money out of nothing. You know what they're going to do? They're going to create money out of nothing. That's very profitable. And so that's what happens. The money supply expands and expands and expands, and that means that the purchasing power of each of those units goes down. So this phenomenon we call inflation, where it looks like prices are going up, not so. What's really happening is that the value of the dollar is going down. And if you have something of tangible value that it took human effort to produce, I don't care whether it is bottles of water or glass or gold or silver or rubber tires or a package of dried milk or whatever it is that takes human effort to produce, and you were able to track the value of that, its purchasing power would remain fairly constant over long periods of time if you used it as barter, because it's based on human effort. But in terms of dollars, the price seems to be going up and up and up because the value of the dollars goes down, down, and down. Today, we're in a situation where if we had lived in 1913 and we had 3 cents in 1913, what we could have bought with 3 cents now costs $1. That's how much inflation, or I should say destruction, of the purchasing power of the American dollar we've seen since 1913. So that's the net effect of this, and this is how the politicians intend to pay off the national debt. Not by taking it from you in direct taxes, not through your income taxes, but through your loss of purchasing power. The time will come in the lifetime of most people in this room when the American dollar will be practically worthless. They'll either convert it into some kind of a new monetary unit, a new dollar, a devalued dollar. Well, they'll give you 1 for every 3 or 5 of the old, or they'll convert it to a new system like an Amero, which is a new currency they've been talking about, to be shared by Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Or it will be converted into a true international currency, which they're talking about right now at the G20 level, which who knows what it'll be called. Let's, for the sake of discussion, call it the you-know. But in any event, something will happen because the value of the American dollar will just go down, down, and down and become worthless. And as I say, one of the things we'll be talking about at the seminar is you better be aware of that, because if you don't get your assets out of dollars, if you have money in dollars, dollar-denominated investments like savings accounts or insurance policies or retirement funds or cash in the mattress or whatever it is, you're just like standing on the railroad tracks and the train is coming right for you. And you better get off those tracks or you're going to lose everything. Okay. That's the Mandrake mechanism. So what did we get? Let me wrap up part number 1 here. We got a corporation, the Federal Reserve System, chartered by Congress, given the exclusive franchise to create the nation's money supply. Wow, what a brilliant stroke of genius that was. We got a cartel that is a partner with the federal government to enforce the cartel agreement and to create the illusion of being a public agency. We got a mechanism whereby Congress can raise unlimited taxes through inflation without the public even knowing that they're paying the tax. They think that inflation has got something entirely unrelated to their government. And we got a law that allows the banks to collect interest on nothing. And of late, we can see we got a golden parachute, which enables the fraudulent banks to pass on the inevitable losses of their operation to the taxpayers in the name of rescuing the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, these rescue packages that they talk about that are being rushed through Congress almost every day now, and these so-called stimulus packages are none of the above. They're nothing less than legalized plunder of the American taxpayers. Well, I'm droning on here. We finally get to part 2, which won't be too long. It won't be as long as part 1. But to just repeat that soundbite, today Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. The first question that comes to many people's minds is, why do the American people tolerate this? How do we tolerate this? And the unpleasant fact is that many Americans think it's just wonderful. They're not tolerating it at all. The folks like you in this room are very savvy. You know what's going on. But the American people have been put through a public education system that does not teach basic economic principles. They do not know what's really going on. They're easy marks for these con artists. They think that government money is free. They really do. I saw a Donahue program some months ago when the debate just started. I think it was about government health care, you know? And the issue was, what should the government do? How far should the government go? How much should it pay? Who should get what? And all of these discussions. And some lady raised her hand, and Donahue went over and gave her the microphone, and she says, I don't understand why the government just doesn't pay for it all. They've got the money. Why don't they just pay for it and get off of our backs? And I swear, everybody in that auditorium cheered and applauded wildly at the statement. I mean, these people are dumber than dirt. They really think that this money comes from someone else. So that's part of our problem, is that we have a tremendous re-educational problem. Not even re-educational, because there's no re part of it. It's just a pure educational problem as to basic economics, which is one of the things that I'm hoping to do after we get through this crash course on money. I'd like to start something on the internet and form what we are planning to call the Freedom Academy, with an important division which will be half-jokingly called a high school course on money for those of us who missed it in high school. Basic fundamentals of what money is and how interest works and so forth. So people need to be educated. Others are desperate, of course. Many Americans are desperate, and they're not too particular about ethics when it comes to family survival. They're in a hole. Maybe they've been enticed into debt by predatory lending practices of the banks, and now they're desperate. They're losing their homes, or maybe they've lost their homes, they've lost their job. And you know, it's easy to see why a person under those conditions is not asking too many questions. They just want help, and they need it badly. I can feel very sympathetic toward those people. Also, no one talks about the free market alternative. You see, the media always frames the debate in terms of, that I just mentioned a moment ago, who gets what and how much and when. They never allow anyone to discuss the option that nobody gets anything. That's just not allowed in the debate. It's how much and who. And who's going to control? And what government agency is going to have the power? And how is it going to be divided up? You know, and will it be transparent or not? And all these issues. Nobody's allowed to say, let the fraudulent banks fail. You know, like. And of course, with that comes the argument: if the fraudulent banks fail, then a lot of people will lose their money who have entrusted that money to the fraudulent banks, and that is unfortunately true. But it's also true that if you don't let the fraudulent banks fail, they will continue to be fraudulent forevermore, and people will lose their money anyway. And they'll lose it all, not just a few people losing some money, but everybody will lose everything, because that system is inevitably going to grind down into total government control over the economy. And then it doesn't make any difference. Everybody loses everything. So those are some of the reasons that people put up with it. This whole issue of executive salaries and bonuses, as far as I'm concerned, although they're very dramatic issues, is totally a distraction. The amount of money involved in these bonuses, although they're huge amounts to our ear, they represent such a tiny part of the total money being pushed through the system. And I think it's like a lightning rod. The politician can stand up there and they can say, I'm all against these big bonuses. You know, this is outrageous. And everybody says, oh, there's a good man. I think I'll vote for him. But meanwhile, the same guy turns around and votes for 1,000 times more money to be wasted by giving it to the bank in general. And so it winds up in the pockets of the same people, maybe not as bonuses, but just by higher salaries or whatever. The bonuses are not the issue. That's not the principle. The principle is that the money is going to the banks at all. So let's talk about the transfer of wealth. A question that arises is, why do we not already see a great deal more inflation than you would expect? I mean, for years, the Federal Reserve has been creating money out of nothing and expanding the money supply, and yet the purchasing power of the dollar, although, yes, it has gone up, and yes, we've lost 97% of it since 1913. That's dramatic. But you would expect in the last 10 years or so it would be just like a straight vertical climb, and it hasn't been. Why not? Well, there are several reasons. I won't take time for all of them, but let me give you just one that you may have missed. If you consider that the economy is like a big bucket of water, and the amount of water in the bucket represents the total money supply, and therefore the more water there is compared to the size of the bucket, which would be the supply of goods and services in the economy, the more water there is, then the more inflation. Let's just use that analogy. Well, why is it that the water isn't running over the sides with all the money, all the water they're pouring into it by the trillions of gallons? You know, why isn't it overflowing? And the answer is because if you look at the bottom of the bucket, there are holes. And the water is rushing out of the bottom almost as much as it's going in at the top. Well, what are these holes? Well, you must remember that when the Fed creates money out of nothing, like Mandrake, he can wave his cape and create things, it also makes things disappear. And when money is based on debt, as ours is, when the debt goes down, the money supply goes down. It is a fact that if all of the debts in America, public and private, were to be paid off today, fantasy, but imagine that it were to happen, there wouldn't be 1 penny of money left in circulation. All of the money out there, the cash, the coins, the checkbook money, the computer money, all of it would disappear back into the bank vaults, back into the inkwells, and back into the computer chips from which they came. There wouldn't be any money out there. This is a fact. It's not going to happen, of course, but that means that when money goes out of existence, or I should say that the other way around, when debt ceases to be, money does go out of existence. And so when people are losing their houses, and there are foreclosures being made, and the value of that house drops down, and the debt that the bank had on its books, they thought, well, we're going to collect $300,000 from this poor sucker over here on this house. And now the bank has the property back on its own books. They call it REOs, or real estate owned. Now they're lucky to sell it for $50,000. What happened to the $250,000? It disappeared. The bank has to write that off of its books, and that money goes out of existence right down through the hole of the bucket. When a person has a $30,000 credit card loan, and they finally go into default, say, I can't pay it, the bank has to write that off of its books. $30,000 just ceases to exist. Mandrake at work. And that goes out of the bottom of the bucket. And so the fact of the matter is that while new money is coming in at the top, a lot of it, huge loss of debt is going out of the bottom of the bucket. So we get this strange phenomenon that in spite of this quantity of new money coming in, still inflation isn't as bad as we would expect it to be. But there's one other aspect of this phenomenon that you should not miss, and that is the difference between who is involved at the top of the bucket and who is involved at the bottom. At the bottom of the bucket, the people losing the money are in the middle class. They're the ones losing their homes, their cars, their savings accounts, losing their jobs. They're losing their credit because of credit card foreclosures or write-offs and so forth. Those are the people that are suffering, and the value is coming from the middle class out of the bottom of the bucket. But the ones at the top who are getting this huge influx of fresh money are the politically favored class. And so even though the quantity of money is remaining approximately the same in the bucket, there's a transfer of wealth moving from the bottom to the top. The people at the top who are politically favored are getting more and more wealthy, fabulously wealthy, whereas the middle class is being squeezed out of existence at the bottom of the bucket. So you have to keep your eye on several aspects of this formula to really appreciate what's happening in American society today. Are we going to have inflation or deflation? I believe that in In the bubble sectors that we have seen, such as the stock market and the real estate market, we will continue to see deflation because the bubbles were so big. In my personal view, they haven't collapsed as far as they will eventually in order to come down to some kind of a reasonable relationship to their underlying value. I think that's particularly true of the stock market, which they keep pumping up and up again to the point where people laugh at how absurd they say for anyone to believe that they could have expected the toxic waste real estate market not to crash. I mean, here they had all these subprime loans. Everyone knew that there was no value underneath it. How could you be so silly as to invest in a subprime loan package of investments, they say now. The same people who were pushing it a few years ago are now saying, well, they were so wise that they didn't do it themselves. But the same thing could be said about the real estate market, the stock market today. Where is the underlying value in the stock markets? Look at the price-earnings ratios. Look at the dividends that the corporations are paying or not paying. Look at the loss in value in the assets. Look at the loss in sales. Look at the shrinking of the companies, the layoffs, and the abandonment of markets. And you tell me that there's value there to support an expanding stock market? It's exactly the same bubble that we saw with the subprime market, in my view. So I think that both of those, the real estate and the stock market, have quite a way to go before they find their true equilibrium. But almost everything else, where prices were based pretty much on human effort, I think we're going to see inflation, and a lot of it. Much of the money that has come into the top of the bucket that we talked about is still in the pipeline in a way. It's still in the balance sheets of the banks and the corporations. They're just now beginning to spend it, but they've been hanging on to it, you've noticed. So it hasn't, for the most part, reached the economy yet. Once it starts to reach the economy, then I think we're going to see a very rapid expansion of the money supply in circulation, and that's when we'll see the true effect of inflation. So I think we're going to see deflation on the bubble markets and inflation on the markets of just about everything else. Again, I'll be talking about that in more detail in the seminar and give you perhaps some tips as to which markets are the best ones to avoid and which ones are the best ones to stick around. And now I finally come to the main theme of part number 2, which is this business about counting your money on the sinking Lusitania or Titanic. I think any discussion of monetary issues in the Federal Reserve that doesn't include a look at our vanishing liberties is very, very deficient and almost criminal, because it doesn't make any difference how much money you have if you lose your freedom. To me, I think that they're the two most valuable things in life, above and beyond, of course, your friends and your family, but I would say your freedom and your health. If you don't have health, it doesn't make much difference if you're sickly, if you don't have health, nothing matters. You're going to be gone in a few days anyway. And if you don't have freedom, it just makes you a healthy slave. You can work harder for the Lord and Master. So I've always been an advocate of paying attention to both areas of our lives. And money is an avenue of enjoying your freedom, in my opinion. Money's primary value is based on the assumption that you have the freedom to spend it in the way in which you wish. If you don't have freedom to spend it, you probably don't even have it in the first place. In every country in the world that has been taken over by totalitarian systems, especially of the collectivist model, where they like to preach about representing the people, We're doing this for the people, the greatest good of the greatest number. It's one of the tenets of collectivism, and you'll find it beneath all of the totalitarian systems of the modern world. Communism, fascism, Nazism, they all are based on the assumption that they represent the people's interest. And there's always some dictator who says, I represent the people and I can tell you what the people need, but don't forget it's always for the people. And so in those systems, whenever they come to power, anyone from the old order that had a lot of money are usually killed. because they know they'll never go along with the new system, and they're usually paraded before the people as enemies of the state. These are the big, greedy capitalists. These are the landholders. These are the managers who made your life so miserable. These are the people that caused the collapse of the system. And so anybody with a lot of money under those conditions may not be so happy to have a lot of money. The reason I'm saying this is not to be pessimistic or to sound frightening or anything, but it's to emphasize the importance of preserving the system of freedom. And I think that any effort to enhance our economic position and our security must be matched by a serious effort to restore the system and freedom in which we live. And that means, of course, we have to slay the creature, because the creature from Jekyll Island is the mechanism by which the totalitarian system that we now are facing is funded. You take that away, and the system would have no way to pay its way. It couldn't control you, couldn't pay for the armies or the police, couldn't do all of these things that we don't like. And so we must get rid of the creature from Jekyll Island. We have to slay that thing. And can it be done? Yes. Of course it can be done. It can be done exactly the way it was created. It was created by Congress. Congress technically has the right to abolish the Federal Reserve System. And so it points us right in the direction we must recapture control of Congress. Writing letters to your congressman is okay if you want to do that, but I say the answer is to replace those congressmen. And so I just want to close now by inviting you all to come to the seminar Saturday if you want to hear some more views on this topic. But most of all, I want you to join with me, and together let's take this creature from Jekyll Island, jam it back into the bottle, put the cork in it, bury it in cement, and take it to the deepest sea and throw it in. Thank you very much.
Wasn't that awesome? That was amazing. Well, we're going to there is a mic in the center of the room, but we're going to forego Q&A. Mr. Griffin has an engagement at 11. But if you would like to ask him a question, you can go to the bookstore, of course, right now and purchase a book or talk to Mr. Griffin there. He'll be there. I do want to call attention to the radio station Rule of Law Radio, who helped this engagement out. They're doing a wonderful job, and 90.1 is a big part of it. They're going and protecting the transmitters, the people putting up the transmitters. So let's all sign a letter on the way out. There's letters there for people to sign. And Mr. Griffin's, the details on the crash course on money is, of course, Saturday, December 12th at 8:30 a.m. Tickets can be found at realityzone.com, and it's being held at the Courtyard Austin Marriott downtown. So if you're looking to attend that. But thank you very much. And I think somebody wanted to say something. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, George, for handing it over. And that was the presentation by G. Edward Griffin. Had great speeches by John Bush, and also the MC was Harlan Dietrich from Brave New Books. I'm Richard Reeves along with George Butler. Thank you for tuning in on liveonlocation.tv. Liveonlocation.tv. Keep an eye on that website because there are always presentations being put on by George Butler and crew. We want to thank Dan for helping and all that's great. It's a tremendous turnout tonight. As a matter of fact, they had to bring in an extra 40 chairs. The AT&T Conference Center had to bring in an extra 40 chairs because it was standing room only. So we loaded up the auditorium here, and it was fantastic. And they stayed till the very end of the presentation. As a matter of fact, it ran a little bit long, so G. Edward Griffin had to go and depart, and he's going to go to Brave New Books now and do some book signing and autographing, etc. So we want to thank y'all for tuning into the webcast and keep an eye out for further projects. Watch for George Butler on thesecrettruth.com, thesecrettruth.com, program on gcnlive.com every Saturday night from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Central Time with George Butler on The Secret Truth. So make sure and watch for that show. If you're here locally in Austin area, or also you can watch on the web and listen on the web, ruleoflawradio.com. I've got a program there between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. every Wednesday night, and we cover a variety of issues on that. So also remind everybody to go to medina4texas.com, medina4texas.com. Deborah Medina can win this race. Don't anybody tell you that she cannot. Rick Perry and Kay Bailey Hutchinson may very well bash themselves to death through this primary because they are in the process of running all kinds of ads via mainstream media. So that could get nasty, and it could help very well allow Deborah Medina to come up through the middle with a great bunch of patriots and independent voters. And George, if you'll give me a signal, are we just about ready to wrap up? Okay. George says it's a wrap, so I want to thank y'all for tuning in. Keep an eye on George's websites, thesecrettruth.com and liveonlocation.tv. And once again, thanks for everybody tuning in. Good night.